Okay, thanks for coming along. It's another good turnout for the Tube. Always nice to see people coming along for the Tube. I must admit, until the book came out, I didn't realise just how much people love the Tube and what love. Well, they do. They do. It's quite scary sometimes how much trivia this system, supposedly a very boring transport system, throws up. Ones like the only tube station to share no letters with the word mackerel. Anyone here know the answer? St John's Wood. People know the answer to that. Are you a keen attender of pub quizzes by any chance, madam? It sticks in the mind. People love this sort of stuff. And I did that, I mentioned that fact at a talk I did at the Transport Museum last year when the 150th anniversary of the tube system came around. And the whole world went mad for it. German TV, South Korean TV, radio stations from all over the world, because this was the first tube system in the world. And people not only have copied the system, they've copied the map. And that's an icon in itself, to the extent that TfL have now made more money from the tube map than they have from running tube trains. But that's not a joke, that's absolutely true. They are absolutely strict as anything on licensing it. And if you do a cover like that, it's slightly different from the hardback cover. This is obviously the paperback. In principle, they'll agree it, and then my publishers had really very detailed discussions with them about what you are and aren't allowed to do. Anyway, I mentioned the talk at the Transport Museum, and I mentioned that mackerel fact. And people liked it, and a lot of people there knew it. And a woman put her hand up and she said, "Do you know the Pimlico fact?" And I said that I didn't. And she explained that Pimlico is the only one of 269 tube stations to share no letters with the word badger. Now, a piece of information as crucial as that obviously had to be shared with a wide audience. So the next day I tweeted that, and a woman responded. She said, "I have lived in Pimlico for 30 years. This is the fact about Pimlico that makes me most proud ever of living in Pimlico." And the pieces of graffiti that you see, and notices, and there was a lost dog notice somewhere around Acton Town Station, and it's one of those, you know, where they've photocopied it, picture of the dog, and they've put it to every lamppost in the street. And there was a picture of the dog, and it said, "Have you seen this dog? Answers to Zelda, but it's deaf." And, you know, the little bits of, the flippant stuff, but also the human drama that you see in a city like this. One of the walks, I think it was the Metropolitan, no, it wasn't the Metropolitan, it was another one where I was coming along that main section between Baker Street along to Euston Station and King's Cross, along the main Marylebone Road. And I'd just gone past Baker Street Station, and a woman emerged from one of the side streets and walked up to a guy that was standing there waiting for her, and they embraced. And I thought, well, she's just met him at the end of a day's work or something. And then the embrace carried on for slightly longer than you'd expect it to. And then I noticed her shoulders were shaking. And gradually, as I got close to them, she finally pulled away from the embrace, and I could see she was in floods of tears. And then I looked up and I noticed that the street she'd come out of was Harley Street. And then, even beyond that, I instantly thought, oh, she's had some bad news. But then I thought, no, maybe it could have been tears of relief. You never know. Maybe the test results weren't as bad as she thought. You never know. That's part of the beauty of a city like this, is all these little dramas are being played out. And you have to make the final 20% up yourself, and very often that's where the fun is, At Paddington Station on one of the walks, it was one where, it was on the Hammersmith and City, because the way I'd walked into the station, I had to walk to the far end of the platform to get to the Hammersmith and City part of the tube, because it's one of those where it's split into two. And I was being a stickler. I was making sure that I went to exactly the right part, because it was on the Hammersmith and City walk. And the platform I was walking along was parallel to the Heathrow Express platform. And there was a guy getting onto the Heathrow Express to go out to the airport carrying nothing but a single red rose. And I wanted to jump on and follow him just to see her face as she came through arrivals, just to see it, So there's that sort of stuff. Like I say, we could all go out, we could all write a book of our experiences of walking around London, and the city, great city that it is, would present us all with different experiences. These are the ones I had in that chunk of 2010. I think actually my favourite story about the Bank of England and the vaults down there was the guy in 1836 who wrote to the governors of the Bank of England and said, I know a way into your vaults. I'll meet you there at midnight next Saturday. And their reaction was very much the same as your reaction. They thought, yeah, right, and ignored it. He wrote again a few days later. And they kept ignoring him, and eventually, just to shut him up, they wrote back to the address they'd been given. And they said, OK, we'll meet you in the vaults of the Bank of England next Saturday night at midnight. So some of them went down there, and it was coming up to midnight, just a few seconds approaching. They thought, well, if he was going to be getting in here, we'd have heard him by now. We'd have heard him coming through one of the walls or nothing. And then just as midnight ticked over, they heard a little grate sound from one of the grates in the floor. And they looked down, and this piece of grating was pushed up, and a head appeared. And it was a guy who worked in the sewers underneath London. And he'd worked out that one of the sewers he worked in ran directly underneath the vaults of the Bank of England. And so they helped him up and said, well, thank you very much for telling us about it, not nicking all the gold. And they rewarded him with a few £100 then, and I worked out it's the equivalent today of £70,000. Which, yeah, a very nice sum of money to have. And this was before stupid house price inflation in London. So you could probably have afforded a very, very nice house in London for £70,000. But it's still not as much as he could have got by nicking lots of the gold and going and selling it. So I think that was nice of him to own up to that. One of the other interviews, having mentioned the Mind the Gap slogan, was a guy called Tim Bentinck. Now, who here is an Archers fan? Who's going to... David Archer. He's been David Archer since 1982. But as well as being David Archer in the Archers, was also for a while the Mind the Gap voice on the Piccadilly line. And so I stopped off, and he lives, coincidentally, on the Piccadilly line. And his wife, who worked somewhere near Holborn, used to get the tube to work every morning. And so she'd get off, and she'd hear her husband going, "Mind the Gap," and she'd say, "Thank you, darling, I will." And Tim was great, and so we widened out the chat, not just about that. Although he said that's when he got his realisation of how much people love the tube and how cool it is. It sounds a strange word to use, but it is, because he told his son, he deliberately didn't tell anyone that he'd done this because his sons were at school at that point, and he didn't want his son's school friends finding out that their dad was the voice of Mind the Gap, because he thought, well, they'll just get the mickey taken. Accidentally, someone told one of his son's friends, and it spread around the school, and all his son's friends thought it was the coolest thing in the world, that their dad was the voice of Mind the Gap. Since the book came out, actually, I did this on my blog last year. I was at Embankment Tube Station one night, and someone had told me a few weeks previously that Embankment Tube Station, the northbound platform of the Northern Line, was the only remaining station where the original Mind the Gap announcement was being played. And in the end, it turns out the very original one was a guy called Peter Lodge, who was a studio engineer, and the only reason he ever ended up doing it was that the actor who'd been booked to do the original session in the late 60s, the actor's agent rang up and demanded royalties. And London Underground said, "You do realise this is going to be played thousands of times a day on the network. There's no way we can afford to pay you royalties." So the agent said, "That's it, you can't use him." So they had to go and re-record it. And the quickest way of doing it was getting the studio engineer, who had just gone in to test the microphone, had sat down and had said, "Mind the Gap," and had done it in his poshest voice. And someone from London Underground turned up and said, "That's better than anything any actor could do, we'll use that." So that's how he ended up being used. It turns out it wasn't actually that one, it was one slightly, a couple of years after that, an actor called Oswald Lawrence. And he'd done one of the nearly original ones, the second or third guy to do it. And that was the one that was being played out, and that was the oldest announcement left on the system. And so I was talking to the tube guard and said, I'd heard that this was true. Was it true? He said, well, it was true until a while ago, a few months ago. They replaced it, because they're constantly updating it, and started using one of the more modern announcements. But then they got a letter from Oswald Lawrence's widow, because he'd died since, saying that was the only recording of my husband's voice, and she'd used to go and sit on that platform since he died. And I'm starting to feel a bit tearful telling this. And she used to go and sit there and listen to it. And she said, "I'm really sorry that you've taken it away." And they said, "OK, we'll put it back." And they have done it now. They've put it back. And that was another lesson in how much people love the Tube. I put that on my blog. It went absolutely mental. And newspapers and radio from around the world. And there was an interview with Oswald Lawrence's widow. At that point, they'd only got a CD copy to give to her. They hadn't started playing it at the station again yet. But there was a nice little clip of her sitting, putting a CD into her player in her living room, and her husband's voice going, "Mind the gap."